Hi, I'm Nate. I had a fun adventure with my manager this year. So I'm a staff engineer, and I do a lot of coding. I write scripts. I write PowerShell scripts. I write Bash scripts, and my manager does not read them. So kind of what set me down this path is I would put in a PR in our GitHub, and it would send a little notification in our notification channel. It says, "Hey, Nate's opened a PR for this script," and I noticed like a minute later it was approved. And I was like, "Oh, that's great! It was approved." And I noticed that that was kind of starting to become a trend. And then I was really starting to wonder, like, is my manager actually reading the scripts? So what does an engineer do? They test the null hypothesis. So I actually made a destructive script, and I gave it a name like, I'm going to fix an error on the user's computer. And I just like made a script that literally deleted their home directory. And I put it in the repo, and I put in a PR. And 2 minutes later, my manager approved it and merged it. And I was like, great. So he's not reading my stuff. So that started to like lead me to the thing of like, is there a way that I can leverage AI to address this problem? Because, you know, as a staff engineer, sometimes there's not somebody above you that can really give you critical feedback, and you're looking at your manager to like, hey, I noticed this or this about your script, your logic's wrong, like to provide you some more like technical feedback on your stuff. And so I was like, well, can I make AI do some of this stuff? And so I kind of started down the journey of like, how do I integrate some AI things into my GitOps workflows in non-destructive ways? Um, so I kind of had to take a crash course with Claude Code and just like learning some of the basics of like how AI works, what you can do with it. And so this is kind of exploring some of the stuff that I could do with AI. So the first thing I really jumped into is like, we need to document stuff. Like AI needs context of what you want it to do. And what I noticed at our organization is like, we had our mono repo and we had all the scripts and stuff in there, but all of our documentation for how to do stuff was over in Google Docs. So the AI, without an MCP integration to go and read Google Docs, it had no idea about anything. And so I started to come to the realization the documentation needs to live where the code is, because that's where you're going to look for it. And the more I kind of bounced around with that idea, I realized that the other engineers will find this helpful, because I would look at PRs from other engineers and they weren't referencing the documentation at all that was in Google Docs, because that's not where they were going to look. And so I really started to come up with the idea of like, let's start putting the documentation right where our stuff lives in GitHub. So Claude and other agents, they like things in markdown format. So, I just started a docs folder. Here's the PR guidelines. Like, if you're going to open a PR, this is what I expect you to do. Here's the naming structures. We actually have something that we use called ADRs for architectural decision records. And so I started putting those in GitHub as well. And those basically just describe our architecture. So you can see here, like, here's our OS query naming structure. Here's how we expect things to be named. And it's an architectural, decision that we've set up. So now AI, my agent, can read my own documentation, and so can other engineers. And this starts to give it a lot more context besides just like going and reading the repo. And then I kind of discovered you have to do this step where you have to like init Claude is like the next thing that you had to do, which kind of creates this like claude.md file at the root of your repo. And you go in and you tell it, like, if you're really lazy, you're just like Claude init. If you're more like engineering type, you might go in there and you might start like writing the stuff in Markdown yourself. Hey, here's how my repo works. Where things are going to be. Here's what my GitHub actions are. Here's where the documentation actually is. For like a larger mono repo, Claude's documentation actually says you should make like smaller claude.md files in like in your folders. So we have a big mono repo. It's got PowerShell scripts, it's got app scripts, it's got bash scripts. And so what I did is I broke all those up into more folders, and I started saying like, look, here's a ClaudeMD file just for PowerShell. Here's a ClaudeMD file just for AppScript for Google. Here's a ClaudeMD file just for bash scripts. And then, put a Claude file at the top and says, hey, look, here's the other Claude files. And what this really does is it helps reduce the context for Claude when it's running. It's not having to read the whole repo. Oh, I'm just going to make a Jamf script and I'm going to stick it in here. Well, it only has to go up so far. It only has to go and read that ClaudeMD file for that directory. And it's going to save you some time. It's going to save some tokens if you really care. You're going to burn down less trees or drain less lakes with AI if you're into like the environmental stuff. And then once I kind of had some ClaudeMD files in there and I had some stuff, I said, okay, now I'm going to build a skill. And a skill is, again, it's just another markdown file that you stick in your repo. You can put the skill files in the repo if you want other people to use them. You could also literally make a repo just of skill files, which I've seen some other places do. And so like we have one at our company. It's basically a Rolodex of skills, and you can go into that repo, clone it, pull out the skills you want. You could run them. How you do it's kind of up to you. I put the skills for my team directly in my repo. And I started to say, what was I expecting my manager to do when I opened a PR? So I wanted him to check the logic, like, hey, was there any logic errors in my script? Okay, well, let me just write that out in this skills.md file. Am I following the naming standards that are in my documentation of my ADRs? Did I have typos? Did I name products wrong? Like I have a tendency to like write CrowdStrike with 2 capital letters in it. Same thing with like Claude Cowork, but that's not the way it's branded. And so people kind of get bent out of shape when it's not the way that it's branded. So like I put stuff like that into the skill to run. And so then I would write a script and I would run the skill to basically pretend to be my manager. And I said, skill, I want you to become an engineering manager. You're going to review this script. You're going to check for these specific things. And then when I would get a script done, I would just run this skill. It would pretend to be my manager. It would start reviewing things. So this is kind of what a little skill looks like after I ran it on a script. It says, hey, you have a bad loopback flag here, or your print summary has counter logic. And it was just a nice check for me because, these are things I expected my manager to look at. But there's sometimes things I missed myself when writing the scripts. And there are also things that, as I was working with other junior engineers, that they were missing logic. Like I was reviewing a PowerShell script and there was logic errors, or he was calling a function that doesn't exist that the AI hallucinated into PowerShell. And so like having a skill like this that I could share with the other engineers really kind of upped our game. So then what did my manager really need when a PR was opened? That's the next question I asked, because I was like, okay, I got what I need, but what does my manager actually want to look at when I open a pull request? So then I could make a skill that said, okay, now pretend you're my manager or my director and you're reviewing this pull request and you don't know how to read the script. You don't know PowerShell and you don't know Bash. Can you generate a PR summary for my manager to review? And so it kind of go through and it basically did a TLDR for the manager. And so it would, I told it like, do a security review. Give me the risk of running this script on systems. Tell me what the operational impact is so that if a CISO or somebody else goes and looks at this pull request that I just opened, they can at a very quick glance without going and reading all my code, get an idea what we're doing. But it also, I noticed that like this started giving like really good output. My PRs would be like, I'm writing a script that fixes this. And it would be like a 2-liner because I'm an engineer and it just needed to be direct. But that's not what my managers wanted to see. They needed to understand the impact. Is there a risk to running this? And then I took it another step further and I said, hey, apply a GitHub label with a risk register and then build a check into my GitOps workflow on merge that says, hey, if the risk is above this, go and add automatically the CISO. Go and add the director. If the risk is too high or the operational impact is flagged as being destructive. So that way, in case my manager didn't see it, like, oh, I'm flagging this up an extra level based on the risk level. And I could make AI kind of do this all in the PR flow, so I didn't have to sit there and do that. So how did my manager react when I basically said, hey, I replaced you and I'm doing it all this way? And he was like, this is amazing. Like, this is clear communication. I have an idea what's going on, and the scripts are getting better. Like, I'm not having to sit here and figure out what you were trying to do and what problem you're trying to solve. And he's like, and I don't know PowerShell, so this is great. And I don't know Bash. He only knows really like AppScript. And so this was a big boost for him and for the other engineers when I asked them, like, how is this working for you? And they're like, this is great. Now my problem is getting everybody else to use the same skills to like adopt and do this when they open up PRs that I have to review. So that's basically kind of how I replaced my manager.